In a moment, I will invite to the bima the extraordinary David Harris, who led the American Jewish Committee for more than 30 years before his retirement in 2022. Under his leadership, AJC was described by the New York Times as the Dean of American Jewish Organizations, and David referred to by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the Foreign Minister of the Jewish people. David has been honored more than 20 times by foreign governments for his international work, making him the most decorated American Jewish organizational leader in United States history. Educated at the University of Pennsylvania and the London School of Economics, he has been a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins and at Oxford University. Though I had admired him for years, I first met him when I served Temple Beth El of northern Westchester in his then hometown of Chappaqua. At the time, I was serving as the president of the Westchester Board of Rabbis, and I invited him to speak to my colleagues as we gathered every year at this season and were wrestling with High Holy Day sermon topics. We always wanted to know what David was thinking about, because if he was thinking about it, we knew we should be too. David has a new book published by Katav. As advertised, the lucky first 100 of you tonight received a copy. It is appropriately titled, On the Front Lines, A Lifetime of Global Jewish Advocacy. Written as a conversation with Agnieszka Markovich, it tells of David's life experience and what he's learned along the way that continues to have such critical bearing on events today. So that will be our topic of conversation tonight. David, would you please join me on the bima? It is truly wonderful to have you here together with Julieta. We thank you, David, for all you've done for our people and for the state of Israel. We have had no better advocate than you, and we are so grateful. I want to begin our conversation with a little bit of your story. What was your first foray into Jewish advocacy? And I don't mean trying to lobby a parent for a toy.
Well, first of all, Shabbat Shalom. And I have to say, in addition to the joy and honor of being together with my friend Josh Davidson, the last Harris to actually stand where I am sitting was our youngest son, Josh Harris, who was married under a chuppah here by the gentleman to my left. But during COVID, we were permitted 20 people in the sanctuary. If you can imagine, separated by 4 or 5 rows.
I'm sure they all remember. We all lived through it.
So lots and lots of very happy and meaningful memories of Temple Emanu-El, this community, and this rabbi. I grew up almost straight across the park on West 74th Street. Our family nominally belonged to Temple B'nai Jeshurun. I like to joke that it was B'nai Jeshurun before it became B'nai Jeshurun. For those of you old-timers in New York, you know that it was reinvented by the Argentine rabbis into what it is today. My parents were both survivors of the Holocaust. I was the first member of my entire extended family born in the United States, and yet it was a very secular home. I didn't have my first Shabbat experience until after graduate school, and I tried to mouth words that I didn't know. But how from that background did I end up here? I think the answer, Josh, is probably 4 events in consecutive years. in my own mind, no one else's mind, I saw myself one day in the Olympics. That was just one of those wishful thinking moments. But I watched them religiously, and in 1972, I was appalled by the murder of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches, and equally appalled by the indifference of the International Olympic Committee and too many others to their murder. In 1973, a year later, I still thought my direction was American diplomacy. In a modest thought, I wanted to be the American ambassador to Moscow one day. But then came the Yom Kippur War. And to my own surprise, I found myself calling the Israeli consulate in New York and volunteering. And very immodestly, I take some credit for Israel's eventual victory in the war because they rejected me. In 1974, still wanting to be a diplomat, I was one of 6 Americans selected to go to the Soviet Union on a US-Soviet government exchange program in an era called détente. And in those months that I was there, I found myself meeting Soviet Jews, going to the one synagogue in Moscow every week, something I had not done in New York, and getting involved in the lives of refuseniks, until in December 1974, I was detained by the Soviet police. I was held for 3 days and 2 nights, and I was expelled to Helsinki, Finland. And at this point, Josh, I began to ask myself whether, instead of American diplomacy, there was something called Jewish diplomacy, or to use your word, advocacy. It was pre-Google. I had to do it the old-fashioned way. I had to ask people, not my own family. And as I was asking and inquiring, the final moment came in 1975. I admired the United Nations. I was an idealist. I was part of that late 60s generation. And yet I saw that United Nations, just a walk from this building, declare Zionism a form of racism and racial discrimination, Resolution 3379. And I was appalled, and that sealed the deal. And then I became a Jewish advocate. I thought maybe in a kind of Peace Corps sort of way for a couple of years and then get a real job. And 47 years later, I left that world actually in this complex. AJC
That's right.
Gave its going away, if you will, events here in this complex. But even after retirement, I discovered there's no way to retire, especially with the world in chaos that is today. So I have the best of the retirement world. I get to do what I want, Josh, but it's still advocacy.
At the time of your retirement, how would you have described AJC's mission?
AJC, which, as some of you may know, has very much of an overlapping history with this institution.
Yes.
And we could spend time on that.
We could.
Your founders and our founders, your great lay leaders and our great lay leaders were often one and the same. On Fridays and Saturdays, they were here, and the rest of the week, they were with AJC. But the mission was always a two-track mission, and fundamentally, that hasn't changed, Josh, though I no longer speak for AJC. We sought to speak up for and advocate for Jews around the world, including many who had no voice of their own. And at the same time, we understood that the Jewish condition was inextricably linked to the global condition. That if liberal democracy and democratic values were not defended and preserved, Jews could not survive, much less thrive. And I would say conversely, if Jews were at risk and in danger, liberal democracy could not survive and thrive, certainly not as we know it.
Your term of leadership at AJC overlapped with quite a few presidents of the United States. Of all of them, are there one or two who you thought were the most effective in protecting Israel's and the Jewish community's interests?
Ouch. For the record, I may be one of the few, one of the remaining dinosaurs. I'm a political independent, and I always believed that to be an effective Jewish advocate, I had to be fiercely nonpartisan, and continue to believe that. Otherwise, the pendulum swings, the Oval Office changes hands, and I didn't think it was right for us to be out in the cold for 4 or 8 or 12 years, Josh. So understand in that context, therefore I'm going to pick one from menu A and one from menu B. And even that's difficult because though my kids think otherwise, I wasn't around when Harry Truman was president, though I was born during his presidency, but I have to give him a shout out. But in terms of the presidents that I interacted with, the two that come most quickly to mind were Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Shall I explain why, or is it self-evident?
No, please explain why.
For me, the first test here is the Kishka test. It's not what they say. Politicians generally are practiced at saying what they think will please an audience. But the question really is, down deep, is it sincere? Is it authentic? Do they mean it? Do they really care? Or is it just another talking point and passing moment? I believe that Ronald Reagan really cared about Israel, and I believe that Bill Clinton equally cared about Israel. And that does not mean that they were always in lockstep with every Israeli government they overlapped with, not at all. With Reagan, for example, we had Bitburg. Some of you may remember the story of Bitburg. We also had the AWAC sale to Saudi Arabia, which the Israelis vigorously opposed. And with Clinton as well, without going into detail, there were moments. There were difficult moments as well. But it fundamentally did not change the relationship, which was built on a foundation of trust, mutual interest, and a recognition that Israel was not just another country, not for Ronald Reagan and not for Bill Clinton. And I hope, looking forward, it's going to be more challenging. I don't know if we're going to get to that or not, Josh.
We can if you're willing.
No, well, it's getting more challenging, but we need good friends in both political parties, folks, in both political parties. And we need to maintain Israel as a unifying issue between both parties. Heaven forbid, and we have sneak previews of this in some European countries, we find ourselves in a pendulum swing where the center-right embraces Israel and the center-left separates itself from Israel. We can't afford that in the United States, most of all, for one very simple reason. No other country on the planet matters as consequentially to the safety, security, and well-being of the state of Israel and the pursuit of peace as this country. Weaken this country's commitment, allow the pendulum to swing back and forth, and we're in big trouble, Israel's in big trouble, and the prospects for peace diminish dramatically.
Can you speak a little bit, because you have alluded to it, about some of the troubling rhetoric that we've heard from both sides that has made Israel a partisan wedge?
If we have to. Of such a beautiful service, and I feel so inspired and uplifted. let's be honest with ourselves and for a moment put partisanship aside in a fiercely partisan era in the United States. We have a problem with the woke left, and not just with the woke left as an abstract concept, but with its obvious efforts to grab hold of the Democratic Party. And you may say that that's far-fetched. After all, this is the party of Truman and Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, who deserves a special shout out as well, as a friend of Israel. And yes, Clinton and Obama and Biden. But the challenge is real. And if you look, for example, not necessarily at the national level, though we have problems within the Democratic Congressional Caucus, as you know, both in the House and the Senate, but look at the local level. Look at the number of city councils, for example, and how they're behaving, and understand that those who oppose Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship are working their way up patiently. And if we're not paying attention to local government, for example, to what seem like relatively unimportant elections, we're missing something very important about the long game that they're playing. And the long game they're playing is to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel. And as I said, Josh, if they succeed, look, Justin Trudeau, who was presumed to be a good friend of Israel, is presiding over a government in Canada where the Canadian Parliament has recently adopted a non-binding resolution calling for an arms ban on Israel during a time of war. The British government, under Keir Starmer, who displaced, fortunately, Jeremy Corbyn, has now also announced a selective arms ban to Israel during a time of existential war for the state of Israel. So if we're looking for, if you will, sneak previews or coming attractions, those should be very sobering reminders. Britain and Canada are about as close to American liberal democracy as I can think of. So we have problems in the Democratic Party. We have problems in the Republican Party. We have populists, we have nationalists who see themselves very much in the image of white supremacists. We have some members of Congress who are in a way almost mirror images of our problems on the left side of the spectrum, who spend evenings, have dinner, attend conferences and speak with people who are known to be sympathetic to white supremacy, to, if you will, neo-Nazism. And I don't know if I can put them all in the same boat, but we have within the Republican Party an isolationist movement which is not necessarily targeting Israel per se, but it's targeting America's commitments overseas. You see that today with Ukraine. Tomorrow, it could be Israel and others that are the beneficiaries of American both assistance and also security commitments.
Well, also for a time, military aid to Israel was held up in Congress by a delayed bill.
We're getting, Josh, we're getting the hints. I think I've reached a point in life where I can skip the layers of diplomacy. Too many American Jews have lost their early warning system. In the golden age of America, and it's been a golden age in the post-war era, and I dare say most, if not all of us in this sanctuary and those watching from afar have been the beneficiaries of this glorious age of American Jewry. But one consequence of it is many of us have lost that instinct for danger. And I don't want to panic people, that would be irresponsible and inappropriate. But we need to find the antennae once again. And I've been working on a research project, maybe it'll come up later, Josh, but I've been studying German Jewry in the 1930s, among other themes. And it's so striking how, as you know, while some German Jews saw the handwriting on the wall and sought to leave wherever they could as fast as they could, others said no. The country of Beethoven, the country of Goethe, the country of Heine, the country of Schiller, the country to which I devoted myself in service from 1914 to 1918 and received the Iron Cross, that country will never betray me. And to put it most dramatically, though it doesn't apply here, certainly not yet, the late, great Billy Wilder had a famous quote, which I'll botch. But essentially it said, the optimist went to Auschwitz. He was from Austria, by the way. The optimists went to Auschwitz. The pessimists have swimming pools in Beverly Hills.
We'll come back to that. Let's turn.
The swimming pools or Auschwitz?
Well, the project that you're talking about. But let's turn now to October 7th. So we just marked the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. Is there a nexus between 9/11 and 10/7?
Absolutely. And if you're from Britain, throw in 7/7, July 7th in Britain. The nexus is a word that you used from the Bima earlier this evening, Josh, which not every rabbi is willing to use, nor other commentators. You spoke about Islamist extremism, correct?
Yes.
Somehow out there, the murder of Robert Kennedy, what happened on 9/11 happened. And if there were perpetrators, they were these vague murderers, killers, assassins, but without a motivation. There was an ideology behind 9/11, and there was an ideology behind 10/7. And you captured it in one word. And notice the rabbi did not say Islamic. We have to be very precise here. Islamist. It's the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. If you have the chance, if you're not familiar with the Muslim Brotherhood, read about it. Read about its ideological pillars like Sayyid Qutb. Read what they believe. And what they believe is that Israel has no right to exist, period, full stop. This is not a discussion about a two-state solution. This is not about a preference for left of center versus right of center political parties in the Knesset. Israel has no right to exist, and their language about Jews is no prettier either. And the exponents of this ideology hate America no less, and the language is always the same, Josh. Israel is the small Satan and America is the big Satan. And you read, as I hope you have, how Iran, for example, tried to target diplomats at a restaurant in Georgetown a few years ago. Or more recently, as the director of national intelligence for the Biden administration said, Iran is linked to the movements on campuses, to the protests, to the instigations. This is not a talking point of Likud. This is the director of national intelligence, Avril Reigns of the Biden administration, saying it out loud, and now most recently, that Iran appears to be in cahoots with the Hells Angels and other radical groups in the United States to wreak havoc against its enemies. So, I know too often in America, everyone filters what they hear now through an ideological lens. Does this mean he's on the right? Does this mean he's on the left? Will he vote for Trump? Will he vote for Harris? No, she's not a relative. We need to look beyond that. We need to have a certain maturity and understanding that groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, their patron saints in Iran, their payroll masters in Qatar, don't give a darn about these, for them, petty differences, whether in Israel or the United States. It's us, the project of Israel, the project of America, that they despise and detest, and improbable as it may seem, wish to destroy. Again, our early warning system has need for new batteries. It's time to replace the batteries.
Part of your conversation with Agnieszka took place on October 8th. And in that conversation, you had already predicted that the world would soon turn against Israel. What precisely were you predicting, and did the world sink to your expectations?
Tragically, yes, Josh. I'm looking at Steve Berger here in the second row, who's a financial guru whom I've gotten to know because we're both, I'm the newbie, he's the veteran on the Brandeis University board. But I'll get every financial prediction wrong. If I tell you sell tomorrow, buy, and you'll get rich. But on this one, Josh, it was abundantly clear, not because I have some prophetic skill, I don't, but because I had seen smaller versions of 10-7 play out, including in May 2021 and previously. Yeah. And you can graph it. On day one, 10-7 or dial back. The press releases, the statements from Western governments tend to be very supportive of Israel, very sympathetic to the victims. By day two, day three, the language begins to change. Here too. All of a sudden, the victims have to share space with language like, we must end the cycle of violence. As if this is a Hatfield and McCoy kind of rivalry with no ability to discern any moral distinction between an arsonist and a firefighter. We begin to hear language about disproportionality. We begin to call very quickly for a ceasefire, even as Israel, by the way, on October 8th, Israel had not yet responded. We begin to hear about victims on all sides, and suddenly the victims in Israel that were targeted on 10-7 become part of this sort of vast group of people called the innocents. No, on October 7th, in what I believe was a genocidal intent, genocidal in the sense of we want to kill Jews, whoever. Pregnant women, we will kill the fetus. Children, we will kill the children. Holocaust survivors, we will kill Holocaust survivors. And this very much is aligned with what you'll hear on campuses about the loaded term resistance. In their minds, resistance is legitimate because every Israeli is a participant in what they believe is an illegitimate project called Zionism. What's Zionism? You all just sang the words of Hatikva a few moments ago. And I'll excerpt from those words, whether you understood the Hebrew or not. Liot am chofshi be'artzenu, Eretz Tzion b'Yerushalayim. To be a free people in our own land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. That's the sum total of what Zionism is. But the baby, the fetus in the womb, to the resistance movement is a future soldier, a settler, a colonialist, and therefore as legitimate a target. So, Josh, it was clear to me that within a matter of days, we would begin to hear the very same predictable calls from many governments, from the United Nations, from many media outlets. But I have to say one thing that did shock me, maybe not surprise me so much as shock me. The Me Too movement, the women's movement, silent, totally silent about women who were raped, who were gang raped, who were mutilated, who were kidnapped, who were killed. Queers for Palestine, marching around, supporting the most illiberal movement on the planet, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-democratic, needless to say, anti-Semitic. Where were those so-called defenders of human rights, women's rights, children's rights? Where were they? At best, they were silent. At worst, they were marching with those chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And there's no second way to understand that chant, I believe, other than the removal, one way or another, of the state of Israel and its 9.5 million citizens, and those who wish to approach them and talk about their support for a two-state solution or their repugnance of the current prime minister are missing the boat. The conversation is not about that now. Maybe in Israel it's about the prime minister. Israelis have the right and obligation to discuss who leads them. But for us, to talk about a two-state solution with people chanting in our face from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and accusing us of genocide and colonial settlerism and all of those other charged words, I would submit is naive in the extreme. The 10-7 folks want us dead. They declared war. And if we don't understand that a war has been foisted upon us, then again, I think we need to change the batteries in our early warning system.
Let's talk for a little bit about the protests that are taking place in Israel now. There is intense anger in some segments of the Israeli population, and it's hundreds of thousands of people who are protesting. Intense anger at Prime Minister Netanyahu for, in their opinion, seeming not to prioritize the return of the hostages, particularly given how other Israeli governments, including those he has led, have given up so much to bring hostages home in years past. How do you assess that anger?
I assess it, Josh, and I will in a moment, without judging it, without taking sides. And that's not a cop-out. I don't believe it's appropriate to take sides. On October 8th, 9th, 10th, as Israel announced its 3 goals, you'll recall, of Israeli response: dismantle, eradicate Hamas, rescue the hostages, and ensure that the next governing structure of Gaza does not include Hamas, right? As a set of talking points, it all made perfect sense. But if you step back for a moment and analyze the first 2 in particular, I believed, and I said at the time, there was a fundamental tension between eradicating Hamas and freeing the hostages. And please understand me, both were extraordinarily worthy and are worthy goals, but simply to declare that you want to achieve both does not ensure that it happens. Because if you want to eradicate Hamas, and that is a worthy goal, then the fate of the hostages becomes much more questionable, inevitably, unavoidably. On the other hand, if you prioritize the freeing of the hostages, presumably through a deal because even the superb Israeli intelligence has not been able to locate all of the hostages, then it means allowing Hamas to live another day, another week, another war. And it also means, and let's not forget, people like Sinwar, you know the name? Were once in Israeli prisons. They were freed in previous swaps. So the Shalit swap, for example, was one Israeli soldier for roughly 1,000. Palestinians who were not in jail for parking violations or scofflaws. And it's known that many of those who were freed returned, like Sinwar, to terrorism. So one has to ask the question, how many more Israelis will be killed as a result of the effort to free those who are currently kept captive? But it doesn't end there either, because the argument keeps going round and round. On the other hand, Israel has always had an implicit contract with the Israeli population, and especially the IDF, that we will never forget you, and we will leave no stone unturned in order to bring you back if you're taken prisoner or you're kidnapped. So, no matter how you look at this issue, I think, Josh, it's not a simple issue to finesse. So I completely understand the people protesting. And in fact, my wife has two sisters who made Aliyah some 50 years ago. That 3 generations of their families are there, and they're at most of the protests. I completely understand them. They want the hostages returned. They want the social contract protected. And what comes later comes later. There are others who say, we can't keep going through this cycle. We'll release another 1,000 or 2,000. They'll come back at us yet again. Hamas will remain standing. We have at some point to draw a line. And I don't condemn them either, Josh. I don't judge them. It's a legitimate Israeli debate, and thank goodness, among all the nations in the region, there's one liberal democracy where people on all sides can go out and express themselves without fear of being imprisoned by their own government or silenced by their own government.
Let's come back to the United States and reflect for a moment on what's taken place on college campuses. You alluded to it. But thinking ahead now, what steps should universities be taking to prevent a recurrence of what we witnessed last year?
Follow Brandeis University. And just to be ecumenical, follow the University of Florida. This is not about who's more in favor of free speech and freedom of assembly, Josh. I don't think we need to try and out-debate each other. This is not what that's about. This is about something else. This is about those students, faculty, staff, outsiders, quite often, who violate codes of conduct blatantly, who may violate local, state, or federal law, and who until now, by and large, I think it's fair to say, have not encountered the C word, consequences. Consequences. So I may dislike intensely those who stand on the quad and chant, down with Israel, or up with the Palestinians. Fine, absolutely fine. I'm a product, as I said, of the late 60s. We were all doing that. But when you cross a line and you call for incitement and you call for violence, or you even call for genocide, when you violate codes of conduct, when you openly support organizations that have been listed by the United States government as foreign designated terrorist organizations, and the Clinton administration designated Hamas and Hezbollah during its 8 years in office. Is there no price to be paid? Is there none? And of course, we saw, Josh, and who can forget, because one of them represented my alma mater, 3 university presidents representing 3 of the great universities in our country who became tongue-tied when asked a very simple question by Elise Stefanik. It depends on the context when it comes to calls for genocide. Does that in effect mean that the first Jews have to be killed on campus in order for genocide to be applicable as a term and universities to be mobilized? And please forgive me, because I'm a huge fan of American higher education. It's one of the pillars of our civilization. In fact, I would call it one of the cathedrals that all Jews, from agnostic and atheist to ultra-Orthodox, revere, because it reflects the strength of our society and its contributions to the world. But when students at a great Ivy League university were told, if you don't feel safe, you can finish the spring semester at home, online, that's not a solution, Josh. That's a cop-out. That's a failure. That's a catastrophic failure. That's an abandonment of students and an acknowledgement that the university has relinquished its ability to defend all students. Yes, the students who protest in Hamilton Hall and Day Hall at Cornell, but also the students who stand up for Israel or who want to express their Judaism proudly and openly and not become Marrano Jews on a campus. So as I said earlier, if you begin to abandon the Jews, you begin to dismantle liberal democracy. You can't have it both ways. You can't tell Jews, we can't defend you, go home and study online, and continue to champion liberal democratic values, which are the bedrock of American society. So yes, there's a lot more that universities can and should and must do in this academic year. And for starters, like Ben Sass at the University of Florida, like Ron Leibowitz at Brandeis University, make clear what university policy is and make clear that that policy will be implemented unblinkingly. It will be implemented. And no student should hide in his room or remove his kippah or take off the mezuzah from his dormitory door out of fear. That would be a complete failure by the university.
I'm going to ask one last question. And it has to...
I'm just getting warmed up.
Well, there's food waiting for everybody downstairs.
Never get in the way of...
Right. And it's related to the topic we're talking about now, and also to the project that you were referencing and the next book that we're anticipating. So maybe talk a little bit about that project, and also what it is you learn from all of that research that gives us some direction forward in this country.
Is Nancy Toff here? Nancy? Yes? Is that in the back?
Yeah, she's right there. Yep.
Okay. I'm mentioning Nancy Toff, and you'll see why in just a moment. I think it was October of last year. I received a phone call, and the lady on the other end said, "Hi, I'm Nancy Toff. I'm from Oxford University Press, and I have some discouraging news and some potentially encouraging news. And Nancy, I didn't take notes, so I'm just paraphrasing it. And the discouraging news is we can't publish your memoir, which is the memoir that was distributed this evening.
So you landed on your feet there.
We can't do it because we don't publish memoirs of that sort. It's nothing specific to you, David. So it landed with Katav and the University of Miami, which became the co-publisher, and that's what's available tonight. And if it's sold out here, you're welcome to look for it on Amazon and have it within a day or two. But she said, I have some other news for you. I think you might be the right person to write a book that we need for a series that Oxford University Press does called Anti-Semitism, Everything You Must or Need to Know. Nancy, is that more or less fair?
She nodded.
Okay, which way? This way?
No, it was an up and down nod. Yeah.
And that was, for me, like a dream. Oxford University Press, for me, is the cathedral of publishing houses, to keep the theme. So since last October, I've been doing a very deep dive into anti-Semitism, past and present, and submitted the first manuscript a couple of weeks ago, and I'm waiting for reaction from the editors, including Nancy, and then we'll work on the second version, and looking forward to its publication. But I learned two things, Josh. I learned many things. I thought I knew something about the subject, not just from my own work at AJC and my own reading and history, but because my wife is a product of Islamist anti-Semitism, born and raised in Libya until the age of 16 and a half, when she and her 7 siblings and parents were threatened with death by a mob that wanted to burn their house down in Tripoli. Went into hiding for a couple of weeks and were able to escape, unlike some Jews who were murdered. My parents were both survivors, and my mother, on top of it, was born in the Soviet Union, and they were refugees from communism. So I had some understanding of these 3 main sources: jihadism, communism, and fascism. But I will confess to you, Josh, that until I began working on this book, I didn't really fully grasp the depth and the breadth and the resilience and the creative capacity of anti-Semitism. It's almost beyond description, although I tried valiantly in a couple of hundred pages to explain it. But there's a flip side to it, Josh, as well, because it's not all doom and gloom, though we can talk about pogroms and inquisitions and ghettos and expulsions and forced conversions and all the rest. We can talk about it all night. But there's another side to it which I think is even more important. We're here. Despite thousands of years of efforts by other major religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, by every illiberal, totalitarian, tyrannical regime on the planet to make Jews an enemy, despite it all, and I can go through it year by year, country by country, page by page, we're here. And we're not just here as victims. We're here as proud Jews. And we're here having children, building schools, building after-school programs, building JCCs, Jewish-themed universities. In other words, we're building a future. And just as Israelis who have created a new Jew who has no trembling knees, to borrow from Menachem Begin, who no longer hides under the blanket or in the closet when the pogromchiks and the Black Hundreds and the Nazis and the Bolsheviks come, but who stand tall and proud and strong. We in this country and in other countries like Canada and Australia and Britain and France and yes, Germany today, and now the UAE, of all places, the UAE, we are here looking to the future, planning for the future, building for the future. Call us stubborn, call us tenacious. We've refused to go over, to change our religion, to change our mindset, to abandon our faith. Again, to draw finally from the last song you and the cantor sang with us, Hatikva, Hatikva, the hope. That's what I draw. Not just the darkness, but the brightness represented by every synagogue, every congregation, every community, every citizen of Israel who stands tall and proud as a Jew and looks to the future. Maybe I'll end it this way, Josh. One of my favorite anecdotes, if I may. Sherlock Holmes, not a Jew as far as I know. Sherlock Holmes was called to a case somewhere in northern England and took his trusty aide, Watson, with him, and they went by horse and buggy. And they had to stop overnight in order to get to their destination the next day. And they pitched a tent and they unfurled sleeping bags and they went into the tent. And in the middle of the night, Holmes wakes up, looks around him, and starts elbowing Watson in the next sleeping bag and says, "Watson, what did you see? What do you see right now?" And Watson looks up and looks around and stretches his face and says, "Holmes, I see the majesty of the universe. I see the effervescence of the stars. I see the infinity of time." And he goes on waxing poetic in this way until Holmes interrupts him and says, "Watson, you fool, someone has stolen our tent." So my message to our Jewish world is keep one eye out. Someone is trying to steal our tent. Trust me. But don't ever let go of that other eye which sees the possibilities of the future. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Please join us downstairs, everyone.